The committee is hearing evidence for its inquiry into the road transport industry, and I do welcome everyone here today. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of the proceedings is being made. Before the committee starts taking evidence, I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. The committee prefers all evidence to be given in public, but under the Senate's resolutions, witnesses have the right to request to be heard in private session. It is important that witnesses give the committee notice if they intend to ask to give evidence in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground upon which objection is taken. The committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground that is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request the answer be given in camera. Such a request may, of course, also be made at any other time. If you agree to provide an answer to a question taken on notice during the hearing, please note that answers are due by close of business, Monday the 10th of May 2021. Now I remind everyone in the room, please to ensure your mobile phones are either turned off or switched to silent. Finally, on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank all those who have made submissions and sent representatives here today. Now, it does give me great pleasure to welcome my very dear friend, Dr. Michael Belzer, Professor of Economics at Wayne State University, Detroit, appearing via video conference. And for the Hansard record, I have had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Belzer on a number of occasions through Washington and through Geneva, and that's why I'm rapt that you could join us today, Dr. Belzer. So for the Hansard record, could you please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
I'm Michael Belzer. I'm Professor of Economics at Wayne State University in Detroit.
So, Dr. Belzer, I'm now going to give you the opportunity to go to the opening statement, and I know the opening statement may be quite lengthy in terms of normal ones, but it's imperative that we get all your evidence on the record, and with the time left, then we'll go to a few questions. But we do have a full book today, and I'm very keen to hear from you. Dr. Belzer, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Senator Sturl, it's great to see you again. I'd rather be in Australia than seeing you in person, but this is what we got to do in a pinch. So here we are. So my presentation is on economic incentives and market pressure and why markets actually require safe rates regulation. So I'm going to walk through these and maybe I'm going to run through them fairly fast so I can leave as much time at the end. We've lost the first 10 minutes here, but I've got about 35 minutes here to present. So I'll go through it quickly and then get the responses. Is that okay? Yep. All right, here we go. So now you want to go to the first active slide. So I will just dispense with saying slide, but in case anybody looks like they're kind of confused, let me know. I'm looking at the slides here. So what now we have here in the United States is truck fatalities on the rise again. They had dropped at the time of the financial crisis, 2008, and the recession that followed, the Great Recession, but they've rebounded along with the economy. And so we're really back in the same place we have been for some time with the number of fatalities somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 per year in truck crashes. Are we getting our bang for our buck? So millions of dollars reduce crashes and fatalities, but crashes and fatalities still go up. In my view, we have to recognize that large trucks operate in a market and are subject to the market's complex system. So we have to consider the market, and of course, labor economics is a part of the market when labor is such a big factor as it is in trucking. I have a couple of slides. There's a first slide here, another slide in here on that's got links in it, and you'll be able to get access to these links. I can make the electronic version of this available if you like. But this is about the human cost of Amazon's free shipping. And Amazon's a case in point because you can see the influence of industrial organization as well as institutions and how the institutions influence safety and health. So Amazon passes the cost of fast free shipping, which is what they sell, to the public. So a basic principle in economics is that any cost not captured in price is external to the market. This presents a problem in this particular case, and we'll see over the course of this presentation that this is a regular problem in a research agenda that I've been working on now for the last 25 years. Economists call these external cost externalities. So an externality is not an efficient use of resource. So we have an efficiency problem and an equity problem on our hands. So society subsidizes external costs like that, safety and health, in the form of death, injury, and property damage on the highway. Low rates. So low rates is a big part of this problem, and those result in low compensation. The low compensation results, of course, in vulnerable workers, and the vulnerable workers result in a vulnerable public. And that's where all of this is a major public policy issue. So the cargo owner or client, as you call them in Australia, which is Amazon in this case, controls part-time on-demand work. Amazon subcontracts its delivery business. So subcontracting deflects the liability and it drives down rates. And it takes advantage of an unregulated chain of responsibility, which is our problem in the United States. So what costs are externalized? Fatigue and fatigue-related illnesses, injuries, and crashes are externalized. Stress-related illnesses, injuries, and crashes are externalized. Costs associated with fatigue and stress are transferred to victims, including the highway users and workers. So economic costs include, in addition to these risks, a damaged market, unpaid taxes, underinsured vehicles, underinsured drivers, disregard for the public, driver shortages, and driver turnover. So competition drives carriers to the lowest price. Transport is a commodity. A unit of transport is a unit of transport. And that's how it gets priced. It took me a long time to realize that and to accept it. Lowest prices drive carriers to the lowest costs. The lowest cost drives freight rates down. The lowest cost then squeezes the drivers because freight rates are low. What do we get? Unqualified, dangerous drivers, dangerous workplace pressures, dangerous and unhealthy hours of work, and outsourcing that reinforces cost cutting. So the stresses associated with work as a commercial motor vehicle or CMV driver put drivers at significant OHS baseline risk. These are also stresses associated with just-in-time logistics, which is our new buzzword, or has been our buzzword for the last 3 decades or so. This requires a pressure for rapid and scheduled delivery, pressure to cut costs, and you know the joke, I want that yesterday and I want it free. So U.S. truckers work really long hours. Now this may seem like they're not long enough. They're not long as Australian truckies, so I'm not really exactly sure what the data are in Australia. But we did a survey back in '97 showing that the median, that's half above and half below, non-union driver worked 65 hours per week. So 55% of the drivers are not paid at all for their non-driving labor, and 70% of them are not paid for waiting or other on-the-job work time. Another survey was done in 2010 by Niosh, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and that shows that the median employee driver, almost all of whom by now were non-union, works 60 hours per week. So employee drivers, according to the Niosh survey, average 63 hours per week, and 22% of all driver time is unpaid, which is 10 and a half hours a week. That's quite a lot. 27% of employee drivers' work week is unpaid labor. And the kicker is the Niosh survey showed that 20% of all drivers exceed 75 hours per week. So you can see a picture from the raw data right here, and the black outlined bars or vertical bars on the right are the hours of work in excess of the legal limit of 60 hours per week. The average is 61.5, but the median is 60. This is with 1,250 long-haul drivers carefully sampled to be representative of the United States. So you can see on the bottom axis, you have hours worked per week. On the vertical axis, you have the number of drivers total. And it shows you just how many drivers are working over hours. So why so many hours? Well, the bottom line here is in the US, the answer rests in conflicting definitions of work. So I'm not positive, but I have some idea that this is more universal than we might think. This isn't just in the US. So the Department of Labor, the DOL, is responsible for enforcing a law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA. And this is an 85-year-old law that defined what work was, what work is supposed to be for American workers. So, under the FLSA, all time during which employees work for an employer, including their waiting time, is payable, unless the employer frees the worker from work for a very specific time and the employee knows in advance that work times start or end, and unless the worker has practical freedom to leave the place of work to go about his personal activity. Watch the stress on practical freedom. And unless the worker is not engaged in work for which he or she was hired, including being available for a call. So according to the Department of Labor, all time is payable if the worker is away from the employer's place of work. All time is payable, the wait time is part of the employee's regular work. And in any other industry, we would know what this meant. But in trucking, it seems like we have this idea that there are special rules. So the Department of Transportation has an administration, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and it has a different definition of work. And it's taken me a while to realize this and the significance of it. So waiting time is non-work time if, according to FMCSA, if, quote, the driver is relieved of all duty and responsibility for the care and custody of the vehicle, its accessories, and any cargo or passengers it may be carrying. And, quote, during the stop and for the duration of the stop, the driver is at liberty to pursue activities of his or her own choosing. So under that is a lot of exceptions. Companies may interrupt the driver's free time and his sleep time. So drivers have to be available. Off-duty time during a shift may have an indeterminate start or end time. Nobody really knows. And the reality is that off-duty drivers lack practical freedom and are tied to the job. Now, as an aside, Glenn, you're a former truckie and I'm a former truckie, and I've been assigned and chained to that truck before. I know what it's like, but I was a Teamster, I got paid. And now the problem is they're not getting paid. So FMCSA regulations now allow carriers to order drivers to log this non-driving time that DOL would define as work time as off-duty. So this explains why drivers log unpaid work time off-duty. The results end up being inconsistent with the policy goal to limit hours of work, particularly in a safety-related job like trucking. So these definitions are inconsistent, and they're inconsistent because time is money. That shouldn't be a surprise to us. We all know it. We all say that phrase, but I'm here to show you the data behind that phrase. Economic theory predicts that workers will trade labor for leisure as their earnings increase. So why do truck drivers work such long hours? Stanley Cito and I wrote a paper that was published in the Economic and Labor Relations Review at the University of New South Wales back in 2018, and it tests something called the target earnings hypothesis. So workers seek their target earnings to pay their bills. This is not all that complicated. Drivers work to reach those earnings targets, and when they reach those earning targets, they'll start reducing their work time. They don't want to work any more hours because they've made enough money to pay their bills. So we expect to find that reduced work time reduces crashes and reduces injury and illness. So what data do we use? First, we use the UMTIP driver survey data from 97-98. Again, I'd love to have more recent data. We have some recent data, but it's not adequate for the job. That is the Niosh survey data. So this is the best one that exists. So employee drivers, according to that survey, worked an average of 64.5 hours per week, and drivers earned an average of 45 cents per mile in today's dollars, which is 5% less than what they earn today. So there's been a 5% increase in these dollars in the last 25 years, approximately. So here's the part you got to put your seatbelt on for, because I'm going to give you some econometrics, and all you got to do is kind of follow along with me here, and don't try to get hung up by it. So this is a two-stage least squares regression. The goal here is to do a complicated thing, and I'm sorry to put it like this, but it's going to give a result which is really interesting, and it's going to give you a lot to think about. So we first estimate the wage rate based on the information that we have on the drivers, and that will be in table 1. So the rate sub I means the mileage rate for the ith driver or the individual driver. So we're estimating the individual driver's mileage rate. The X's are the characteristics of the driver and the job that determine the rate. The betas are the parameters that we're going to estimate. And so we're going to plug that, as we do here, we're going to calculate that first. Let me say that we're going to calculate that first. We're going to estimate the mileage rate for all drivers. It's a highly significant model. And you see that variables that you think would be significant, like experience, tenure, union membership, size of the company, miles, paid days off, those are all very significant predictors of what the mileage rate is going to be. So we're going to take that mileage rate that we're going to predict in this equation, and we're going to then go to the second stage, and we plug it in here, use this fitted wage, we call it, to estimate the hours of work at each wage rate. It's going to produce a pretty picture when we're done, so bear with me. So the hours, again, are the weekly hours of the individual driver. The W is the fitted wage of the individual driver from the wage estimation equation. So now we're using a calculated wage rate. The Z's are characteristics of the driver and job, just like we had in the last one. These are the extra variables that we can plug in because we have them. So that gives us this model, this outcome, table 2. So this is the weekly hours of work equation. And bear with me, there's one more step. So we plug the estimated wage rate from the first equation into this hours of work equation. So that gives us the fitted rate, the square of the fitted rate, and that's going to turn out to be really important. I'll show you in a minute. Age and age squared, these are classic. These are control variables to expect. The percent of non-driving time that the driver has. So how much time does the driver have that's non-driving? And then a separate variable for the unpaid time. Because remember, more than half of all drivers are not paid anything. They're paid 0 in the U.S. for their non-driving labor. So what do we get? This allows us to predict the hours the drivers will work based on their wage rates. And what we get is this curve. This is called a backward bending labor supply curve. It's an unusual thing to find because you don't normally, in our world, find people working such crazy long hours as truckies work. So we estimate the drivers would work 60 hours at just less than 60 cents per mile in 2017 US dollars. So these numbers that are on the graphic are the original numbers from 20 years ago. So I'm updating that according to the inflation rate so you can kind of realistically understand what that is. Higher paid drivers will reduce their hours of work, leading to greater safety and health. So what you see here, I'm going to run I guess I can't even run my cursor on it on your thing. So if you start at the bottom where the bottom hook of that loop this is the fish hook, you can see that around 66 hours per week, which again is 6 hours more than the legal limit, drivers are getting paid 25 cents a mile in the normal or in the pay rates of that time. So which comes out to around 40 cents per mile in today's rates. And if you pay them more money, they will work more hours until they reach that inflection point. And that inflection point that corresponds to 70 hours, which you can see it's the second to last vertical hash mark. That 70 hours is the point at which drivers will start to choose to work fewer hours. And this is frankly what we want them to do, is to get paid while working fewer hours. Really, what's wrong with that? So what they do is they choose to turn down work at that point. And when it gets up to 60, you see it's 60 junction at 60 hours per week on the left-hand side of this graphic. That's the point at which they're getting paid 60 cents per mile in 2017 dollars. So that's what essentially that suggests in our terms, in terms of wage rates, what a safe, at least a starting point for what a safe rate might be. It would be a rate that we would get at the point estimate would be that they would be working 60 hours per week. And working 60 hours per week is still a lot of work to any civilian who's not a truck driver, but it's a lot better than drivers who are working 70, 75, 90 hours per week. Second research project or paper recently done is safe rate on unpaid labor. So we're looking here at non-driving pay. Remember, I talked about this idea that they have unpaid non-driving labor time. So my former PhD student, Takahiko Udo, and I published a paper in the Economic and Labor Relations Review. Everything good seems to go into Australian journals. The workers trade labor for leisure. This is the basic premise in economic theory. This is a theoretical model. It's really quite simple, though. This is a utility function, and drivers' utility for their money and where they're going to choose to work fewer hours and trade to take some time off rather than to work so hard. And that I star is at least a theoretical point at which that takes place. So I is the regime change. The point of regime change is the level of income at which the marginal utility of more income decreases acutely as the income goes over. And that's what drives workers to turn down work and work fewer hours, which again is what we need them to want to do of their own accord if we want to make the highways safer. So I star might be called the time is money point. I kind of came up with that idea as I was reviewing this for the presentation. I like the time is money point. So what do we do here? Again, an ordinary least squares statistical model here. We're trying to predict the hourly work hours, right? And we have two variables that turn out to be significant. One is non-driving, are the drivers paid for their non-driving labor? And second of all, the mileage rate. Okay, so that's the mileage rate. It's estimated that they actually make. So we have some regression results, and I'm just showing you the top line picture here. So what you see is that non-driving paper is highlighted in red, so it's easy to see. It's highly significant at the 1/1000th level, so it's very significant, and it makes a really big difference. If drivers are not paid in any model that we use, if drivers are not paid for their labor time, for the non-driving labor time, it's going to predict that they work more hours. So it is exactly what we think it would be. So what does this tell us? Paying drivers for all their work time, which includes all non-driving work time, predicts that drivers will work fewer hours. If drivers are paid for their non-driving work, the trucking companies and the cargo owners or clients for which they haul this freight will avoid delaying the drivers because time is money. And they'll get them back on the road. They don't want to pay for that time. Right now, that time is free. It doesn't matter how much of that time we waste because it's a truckie. We don't really care. Well, this makes them care because they have to pay for it. So this explains why paying for all driver time is essential. So then I want to go to another study done by this together. Is all very recent stuff now here with Dr. Kudo that published in Safety Science. So we again use Niosh long haul driver survey data. We use this efficiency wage theory, which says that better wages attract better workers and more stable workers, and it gives them incentives to be safe, which is a good thing. So this theory predicts that higher paid drivers will be safer. So it also uses the same theory of the labor-leisure trade-off. So we use the economic theory that is standard to make these predictions. We're not doing anything fancy here. This is just straightforward labor economics. We want to predict the expected number of moving violations in the past 12 months. So here's our regression model. And the only things that are significant are, here's the kicker again, only mileage pay rate and employer-provided health insurance predict moving violations. So the more your pay and whether you're actually getting health insurance from your employer, there will be fewer moving violations. That's our safety measure. What does it tell us? Higher paid drivers are safer. Again, I feel a little relentless, but I'm just going to be relentless because that's what I do. You already knew that. Higher compensation is associated with a lower probability of having moving violations. Employer paid health insurance is also associated with a lower probability of having violations. Well, we want them to have fewer violations, just like we want them to work fewer hours, because we want them to be safer. I'm going to switch back to the granddaddy of this project, a big paper that we did. All of this is cited in the last 3 pages and linked in the last 3 pages of this presentation, so you can always go back to the links. So, paper that we did in 2002, I know it's been cited repeatedly in Australia. I'm referencing it. I'm specifically going forward to a paper by Rodriguez Targa and myself in 2006 that followed a particular one of those studies. So we used in that study, a study of J.B. Hunt, a national motor carrier's second largest truckload carrier in the country. We had 96,000 driver observation months for 1 year before and after a major wage raise. Now, a major wage raise is 39.1%. That turned out to be a lot of money. They advertised to hire new drivers that would be good, and they got them. So we implemented something that's even more complex called a Cox Regression or survival analysis to predict the probability of a driver crash month to month. So bear with me, that's the overall model, and you can, if you want to study the econometrics, it's all present in those links. But doing that allowed us to figure out what's the probability that drivers would have their crash based on their pay. So we had that. Well, here's what happened. The crash risk declined between 50 and 75% immediately after that pay raise. So on the left side, you see before the pay raise and an empirical crash risk different by different months, but between 2.5 and 3, somewhere around there. After the pay raise, it starts at about a 2 approximately and drops all the way down to 1. So we have an empirical crash rate of 0.01, whereas we had an empirical crash risk of in the neighborhood of 3. So it's like 1/3 the crash risk once the pay raise was implemented. At the mean, each 1,000 miles driven per month was associated with $381 of greater earnings, which produced almost 25% lower turnover. Why? Well, the drivers were making their money and the company was enforcing the hours of service regulations so they could go home, or they could at least stop working and take some rest. So 1% higher pay resulted in 1.33% lower crash probability, and the biggest reduction in crash probability happened at the lower pay rates. So we know that those low-paid people that I showed you in the labor supply curve, the backward bending labor supply curve, those people were at high risk, shifted out of risk. And that's what the company wanted, and they were willing to pay for it. It's a very impressive experiment on their part. Our newest study is done by another former PhD student and I. We drove this to completion during fall of 2019. So this is part of his dissertation, and there's a citation of his dissertation. It's going to go out to a review for a journal, hopefully by the end of the week. We are measuring the relationship between regulatory violations, which are defined by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, pay or pay incentives, which is what we think about when we think about it in economic terms, and crashes. So now we have a real hard measure of crashes because it comes directly from the Motor Carrier Management Information System, which records all crashes. All reportable crashes are there. So that's where our starting point is to measure our crashes. And then we use average earnings data that come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that's state by state. So as a result, we just use intrastate trucking companies. So that's the point here. This is an exercise. I didn't believe he came up with this ingenious idea because we were kind of stuck because we don't have data on pay for the carrier, for the drivers, or at the carriers. So we have to kind of improvise. And so he said, well, what about the pay rate on average within the states? And we'll just look at intrastate carriers. Well, there are 14,500 some odd intrastate carriers. So we have a lot of carriers to look at. And we did, because we have good data. So crashes are a function of violations and MICMAS. We know that they're related to the average, they're related to these, they're called the basics. So these are the regulatory categories: working time, unsafe driving, driver fitness, substance abuse, and vehicle maintenance. But we add into that. That's what they measure already. And we find some of them are statistically significant and most of them not so. But state average hourly pay rates for drivers of heavy trucks, we plug in there as our proxy for an estimate of their hourly wages. The thing I want to show you in our results is this line that says L wage down there. It's highlighted all the way across. So that's a really big number. You can see that hours of service violations have an influence, but look at the size of the negative influence that wages have. Wages drive down crashes by a lot. So HOS violations are significant predictors of crashes, but the average statewide wages for heavy-duty truck drivers have 15 times as great an influence on crashes as hours of service violations have on crashes. So if you really want to know where the crashes are going to be, find out how much these guys are paid. So working time, what does it mean? Working time matters. An increase in one carrier level hours of service violation adds 1.28 more crashes. Remember that work hours are inversely related to pay rates, so fewer hours of service violations comes from working fewer illegal hours, which seems like an obvious thing, but I'm just pointing it out. Working time and pay are two halves of the same coin because time is money. The effective hourly wages is huge. So 1% higher hourly wage at the mean corresponds to a 3.16% fewer crashes for a motor carrier. That's more than 3.1% ratio, by far the biggest effect of the model, and far outweighs any other factors that the FMCSA has been collecting that predict crashes. So finally, does safety pay? Well, there's another PhD student, Michael Faulkner, working on the JB Hunt data, following up on the research that we did back in the day. So safe rates and the return on investment are connected. So you know that companies want to know what's the business case for safety. And what I'm here to say is that the business case for safety and the public policy case for safety are basically the same. Companies will make more money with higher paid experienced drivers, and we can show this. So here's higher paid experienced drivers in the comparison in safety. That spike up there at the top, those are inexperienced drivers at the lower rate of pay. And you can see that the factor difference is really big, in the neighborhood of 2.5 times as high as experienced drivers' crash risk is. So the probability of them having a crash, way higher. This will not surprise you, an experienced truck driver is safer. This gets better by about the first year, plus there's so many quits involved here when truck drivers find out how rough this job is that they drop out. And so it's only the survivors that end up at the bottom, and they are better. But meanwhile, we've had a lot of people injured and a lot of damage and maybe people killed as a result of this low paid policy, and the higher paid policy works. But how does it work for the company? Well, here's a measure right here. Here's the measure of driver productivity by experience. So you see the experienced drivers are on the top line and the inexperienced drivers are at the bottom line. And the experienced drivers can produce about 10%, almost 10% more productive revenue miles per month than the inexperienced drivers. And that stays true for the entire period of observation that we have. So this is a really big thing, and it says they would be better off if they hired more experienced, better paid drivers. So higher paid drivers who are more experienced are more productive and stable. They get about 1,000 miles more paid miles per week. They have a significantly higher retention rate, and that is a really big factor. And the fleets that have lower turnover are much safer because the workers on new jobs are safer. On new jobs are more risky. The workers who've been on the job for a while, have some tenure, they're safer. All right, what's the return on investment? So we measure the expected net present value. We estimate this. The ROI shows the high pay for experienced drivers pays off. So this is smart for the company as well as being smart for public policy. So higher paid experienced drivers have a 285% higher expected net present value than the lower paid experienced drivers. This is not what we would in economics, I suppose, call the zero sum game. Whatever I pay you is what I lose. This is a joint gains thing. This is what people in the bargaining world look for, is to find where both sides can win. Well, this is a win-win. So the expected net present value to the firm of the higher paid experienced drivers is almost $10,500 greater than the expected net present value of the lower paid inexperienced drivers. And this is stable over multiple years of time. And this is a really stable result, and it shows that safety pays, and it pays to be safe. Well, finally, I want to show you one more thing that isn't my own research at all. I mean, I contributed by talking to these people when they asked me to. It's detention time. So this is a study of detention time done by the Office of the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Detention is the extra time during which cargo owners hold up driver pickup or delivery. So detention time adds risk, and they were able to determine that. So this is data that they were able to get that I wasn't able to get. So detention time is defined as holding up a driver for more than 2 hours. Well, so holding up a driver for any time is a problem if the driver is not paid. Holding up for more than 2 hours is just a really big problem, a much bigger one. Before 1980, that is before deregulation of the industry, collective bargaining contracts, and remember that 60% of all truck drivers then were Teamsters. Before then, collective bargaining contracts required payment for all work time according to the FMSA definition of work. So I'm circling back or pointing back to the definitions of work that I talked about before, not the FMCSA definition of work, which has developed pretty much during the Bush administration. So in the last two administrations ago, I guess, it was during the Audis, as they call them, I think. So after deregulation, unionization in the US for trucking dropped somewhere around 90%. And shippers still expected all this free time. So non-union trucking companies could not collect from the cargo owners, and they stopped paying the drivers. Well, the drivers didn't get paid, and as a result, the drivers couldn't collect on the time that they put in. Well, one of the things that we've done to sort of try to solve this problem is this electronic logbook. And I think that you guys have tachographs and maybe something similar to this. This is supposed to be, you can't rig it or cheat it, but I've found out that it's kind of systematically rigged and cheated, and I'll explain how. The ELB, or electronic logbook, cannot determine what the driver is doing. It only knows whether the truck is moving or is it stopped, and it knows where this is happening, but that's all it really knows. So FMCSA inspectors have to take the word of the driver and the carrier that they really are off duty. When you show up to a shipper or consignee and they tell you to wait a couple hours, wait out in the lot, and we'll get to you when we get to you, you log off duty and you're supposedly really off duty and free to go about your business, but you're waiting for them to call you. This is not off duty. So this is trust without verification, as Ronald Reagan called it. So drivers log off duty what the FLSA defines as work time, because they don't get paid for it and because their bosses tell them to do it. They actually get required to do it. So the economic principle behind detention will be that people will consume an infinite amount of a free good. Back to time is money. So shippers and receivers, clients, they have no incentive to conserve free carrier delay time and labor delay time. They want that truck ready when they want it, and they really don't care about the driver or the company, trucking company, sitting there twiddling its thumbs waiting to move the freight. So the ATA estimates that an average length of haul today for a long haul load is around 550 miles. That's about 1 day's drive. So that means that the average driver may load and unload once a day. But of course, if he gets held up, demurrage or gets held up with a detention, he won't get that next load off at all. He won't get that next load on either. So the drivers give away up to 4 hours of free time every day. That unpaid delay time values carrier and truck and motor carrier and driver delay time at zero. Again, consumers will consume an infinite amount of whatever's free. So the OIG detention time study has some powerful results for safety. The first 15 minutes of detention time, which is over 2 hours, increases the average expected crash rate by 6.2%. That causes one additional crash per 1,000 power units. It causes more than 6,500 additional crashes per year. Crashes may increase just because the detention time increases. And a really bold point here is every 5 percentage point increase in the proportion of stops that result in detention is associated with a 4.7% increase in expected crash rate. So what FMCSA found in their 2014 study, 10% of all stops experienced 2 or more hours of detention time, that every one of those detention times, that 10%, they average 1.4 hours, which means that 10% of all stops had total stop time averaging 3.4 hours, for which the driver and the carrier won't get paid. This is not a good situation. It's not tenable for safety, and it's not right. So detention time costs money. Time is money. Detention is associated with between $1.1 billion and $1.3 billion lower annual earnings for for-hire CMV drivers in the truckload sector. That's between $1,281 and $1,534 per driver per year. And I will say to anybody who will listen, if you have to write your employer a check for between $1,281 and $1,534 per year as kind of a tax for going to work, you might quit your job too. So it's really not a big surprise. People act awfully surprised that people quit their jobs because they misunderstand what truckies do. So detention reduces motor carrier net income by between $251 and $303 million per year. That unpaid labor time contributes to excessive driver labor time. Excessive labor time drives up crash risk. And so there are policy implications for this. And now I'll finally wrap up. Higher pay rates and pay for all work time will reduce drivers' incentives to work illegal hours. Requiring pay for all labor time would reduce the incentive to log unpaid work time as off duty. So driver incentives will line up with our policy objectives, what we want to achieve. Carriers could not whipsaw the drivers. Cargo owners and clients could not whipsaw the carriers. Neither can race to the bottom for cheap labor. And it might make truck driving attractive again, sort of an echo of a current meme. So summing up, the low road costs the economy billions of dollars every year. It encourages an inefficient use of all resources. It's expensive in safety, has expensive in safety and health costs, and that expensive safety and health costs reduce gross domestic product, which is national income, which explains why economic forces explain safety and health outcomes. Now, quickly, I'm going to walk through all of these, and the exam happens at the end. I'm just saying these will be available to anybody who wants them. There are supplemental and reference resources that I've got. My bottom line to sum up, and I'm glad to stay as long as you like to answer questions, but I recognize we're running probably short on time. The economic approach to safety and health points the way to policy solutions for everybody's benefit. Everybody wins if we do this. Safe rates will save lives, it'll allocate resources efficiently, and it will grow the economy. So thanks very much for being patient with me as I rattle through these things so fast. Back to you, Earl.
Yeah, Dr. Belzer, thank you so much for that. And I'll just give my colleagues, Senator McDonald and Senator Hanson, the chance to unmute so I can go to them. But just quickly, and I did, and as you know, with my extensive work with the Teamsters and with President Hoffa, and talking to many truck drivers in the United States, our problems are very, very similar. It should come as no shock, as you do know that, Dr. Belzer. But there's a couple of things that, I will say here that I do want to get to the top of the supply chain squeeze. But here in Australia, just while I do this, that we have been a very productive industry. There is no doubt about that. But in Australia, productivity means how much more of your crap can we cart for nothing? And I noticed that in the States, on my last visit, you've now started road training through a number of states there, which we've been doing for many, many years, but it doesn't equate to the company, one, getting paid any extra, and two, to this day, I still struggle why there's forward loading and back loading. I don't know if you have that rubbish, but we do. But one thing that you do have up on us is that, at least in the United States, thumbs up from Dr. Belzer, you do have backloading. So in the United States, at least they have the common sense to be able to have a decent sized cab. We aren't even mature enough to have that over here, because then we start talking about increased axle loadings and we can't get enough free rubbish on the back. So there you go, Dr. Belzer. So Senator McDonald, are you there? And have a question, or Senator Hanson?
No question, Senator Still.
Okay, thank you. Senator Hanson?
Yes, look,
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, he can, yep.
And he does, right. Okay. I was very interested in your presentation about the hours that they work and what they get per mileage. Senator Still, you probably know more about it. How does that compare with us in Australia with per mileage, the hours that they work compared to America? Are we basically on the same par? And where I'm leading this is that if we don't address the inland rail, and that's what this is all about, and about cabotage, that means more trucks are going to be on the road. You say about 5,000 truck accidents a year that happen in the States. Are we headed down the same path, or are we there already?
I think in fairness to Dr Belzer, Senator Hanson, yes, we do have similar arrangements. We have decent employers who do pay by the kilometre and they do it properly and then they top up with hourly. But unfortunately, we have a lot that pay kilometres, then they don't pay the actual kilometres work. Same as what Dr Belzer said, that we have the same problem over here, and it's been evidenced in this committee. Many truck drivers are waiting at distribution centres, at clients' premises, where they do not, and this is their words, they do not put those hours in their work diaries or their logbooks, because then their hours to drive after they've loaded or unloaded is limited, exactly the same as the United States. And in terms of the inland rail, for you, Dr Belzer, that we have in this nation, there's a project to build a massive inland rail along the eastern state spine, which is so flawed that it will probably not get used by the rail industry. Hence, our freight task is going to double by 2030. And unfair to you, but that's what's happening over here in Australia. Probably no different than the United States.
So we have we call it intermodal, right? So we have intermodal in the US, but we know, I would imagine intermodal, if you could get the rail lines to survive, you could run from Alice to Western Australia to Perth. You could even run from some of the eastern cities to Perth. But I will say that in the United States, anything shorter than 500 miles is not economically viable for intermodal. It just costs too much money to take a container, put it on the train, take it off the truck, put it on the train, take it off the train, put it on the truck, so forth. So that's what our dynamic tends to be. And our countries are approximately the same size. I never thought that there was so much open spaces as I have found in the outback, so it does stretch out for a ways. But other than that, we're really pretty similar. And we have good companies that pay by the mile, and as you say, top off with hourly. So that's the way it was in Teamster contracts before deregulation. I can't speak to the current Teamster contracts. There are relatively few of them, but that's the idea, is you pay miles and hours. So it's hours when you're stopped and mileage when you're driving. And if we had that kind of system, most of our problems, I think, would go away. And you'd have to be paid minimum wage once you're actually paying people, but they don't even have to pay minimum wage in the trucking industry for your non-driving labor time, as long as your overall time, including all of your mileage, still is minimum wage. But you have no record of the number of hours worked because the truck drivers are not logging them. You get in a line at a grain terminal to pick up grain, and you're going to sit in that grain terminal and inch your way forward, and you might spend 8 or 10 hours in that line to get forward. You're going to mark that as off duty, and then you're going to go to work. And you might well be overloaded, according to one of my colleagues in Australia who told me that was a common problem in grain. So I think that's true in our country as well. And so this is not the solution. They need to be logging the people in when the driver comes in. They get in line, that's logged in, and that's off duty. Let the company move the unit. And if you're not paying the driver enough money, you won't be able to keep drivers. So you'll eventually get drivers to either companies to either pay drivers more money or go out of business, and that's fine. Pay people more money.
Senator Hanson?
Pay a safe rate.
Senator Hanson?
No, that's Doctor, do you know about to touch on about cabotage in America, or I don't know how they term it, Senator Stirl, but the trucking industry, is that in competition with the domestic freight travel?
Well,
I'll try to answer that, but you tell me if I've misrepresented something. So, first of all, cabotage is a French term, and it refers to picking up and delivering in different countries in the European Union. That's the first representation of that, okay? And I have a paper on that in a book that was just published in 2020 in honor of Professor Michael Quinlan, and I'd be happy to refer you to that, where that's described in some detail. In the United States, cabotage is not legal, but we're talking cabotage between the US, Canada, and Mexico. So that's different countries. So that means that a truck that comes with a load from Canada to the United States has to have a prearranged return load back to Canada or a prearranged ongoing load to Mexico and vice versa. But you cannot do work within the United States. So a Canadian trucker and a Mexican trucker cannot compete directly with a US trucker doing that work. Now, whether they do or not is another question. The data are not very good, right? So it's really hard to tell. Australia is one big continent, well, one modest-sized continent, the same size as the United States is, but it's all one country. So that's where I don't quite understand your local definition of cabotage. Are you talking about state-to-state cabotage?
It's the shipping. We have foreign shipping in Australia. And so therefore they allow it to actually move the cargo around, which does affect our rail freight here. So they're taking the business away, which is putting strain on our own Australian businesses.
These are with
here.
foreign drivers operating their trucks. This is
ships,
just like
foreign ships in Australia.
Oh, every time I thought I'd seen the worst, you're going to show me something more worse.
Well, see, Dr.
So this is
Belzer,
exactly what we found when we studied Europe. So what we found was, since the European Union expanded, most of the work of Western European truck drivers are union members. Many of them are union members, but it's done by Eastern European, Eastern Bloc drivers, and some of those actually have laundered licenses, and they might be from Kazakhstan or the Philippines or some other place, Russia, Ukraine, places that aren't in the European Union, and they're working for about 10% as much money as the Western European, or I don't know what, there's terms for this in European Union language, but the original European Union drivers. So that sounds like the problem you have with drivers who are literally imported from a poor country at those rates to compete directly with the drivers in Western Europe. And what I'll say, that my shock, when I realized that was happening, that was a shocker. And that's why I think that's a big takeaway for me from that paper and the research that we did. We actually are a more conservative country. We don't allow that.
No, you've
But
got
the
the Jones
European
Act.
Union, it's not.
Others. Yeah.
What's that?
So you have the Centre of the enhancements going particularly along foreign shipping, applying coastal trade here, which is affecting our rates because rail's getting squeezed out. Trucking is trying to compete with that, which they can't. So our term, you got it.
Cabotage around the ports.
Cabotage around the coast.
Okay,
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
Well, you've got the Jones Act, so
competition.
yeah, that's right. I hope that helps in the hands.
Okay.
I didn't realize that.
Chair.
Thank you very much.
Further questions?
No worries, thanks. Look, Dr. Belzer, before I let you run away, I do want to ask you, you talk about if the drivers are paid, because here in Australia, my argument and a lot of the argument here in Australia is this is not an employer versus driver situation. What we're very keen to put out a major proportion of the representatives of the road transport industry in Australia want to work together to push back against the supply against the push from the top of the supply chain. We don't see it as a boss versus employer thing, which I know you don't either. But what I also wanted to just raise with you is say, if your drivers are paid properly, number one, if companies are paid properly, then on to drivers. Bearing in mind we still have the rat bags out there that will just pocket the extra money, that's everywhere. But you said that if the pay rates are better, and you've had 25 years of this, I haven't. I've been on the road doing my stuff. You've been doing it, studying all these projects and all that. But we would attract, or we would help to go to easing the pain of the driver shortage. Here in Australia, we have a shocking driver shortage. But we also have, and I know you don't have the answer to this, but we also have companies that do pay properly, and a lot of small family businesses treat their drivers like their family, and they pay properly. And yet we still can't attract drivers. What's your 25 years banging your head on this wall? Can you help us out? Is that similar in the States, or do you have reasons why that happens?
It's similar. Our small folks, I suppose, are the owner-operators, but it gets more complicated because most of the owner-operators, we have to have operating authority. You don't have operating authority in Australia, and we do. So they have an operating authority, and maybe it's an operating authority of one. But what happens is there are companies, like Hunt was a good example, paying the right wage and doing the right thing, and had a terrific result. More productivity, safer, less turnover. What's not to like here? It was really hard for them to measure the profitability. But it took a long time to try to work this through. My apologies to Hunt. Their COO asked me to figure this out about 15 years ago, and it took a long time to try to figure it out with the data that we had. But the bottom line is that it does pay it does make sense. The return on the investment, that is the ROI, is positive if you pay people more money. But the market, you have to have, the reason for safe rates is you have to have a common denominator, not the lowest common denominator, but one that achieves safety. And if you achieve that, you're going to be much more able to attract drivers into the industry. So I think there is no such thing as a driver shortage. It's a shortage of pay. If we pay people more money and we make the conditions better, it will attract people in to do the work.
But
that's really, I think, the bottom line.
Sure, but Dr. Belzer, and I agree with you, but there also needs to be an enforcer there. So the good operators, the good employers, and the drivers who want to make a decent wage aren't, what's the word I'm looking for? Penalised, because here in Australia we have a shocking record of enforcement. They're missing in action. Is that the same in the States?
I don't want to say anything too impolitic, but I think the FMCSA has kind of been barking up the wrong tree. And I think it's because they've been required to. They're doing a really good job so I'll say this, especially compared to European Union enforcement, which is abysmal. So the United States comes out smelling like a rose. I was rather shocked. We have an enforcement regime and we hold people to it. It's still hard to do. It's kind of like whack-a-mole. I don't know if you have that term, whack-a-mole. And there's always somebody popping up. You call them the dirt bags or something like that. So there's always somebody out there. But they do a pretty good job of that. But my argument has been that because they don't look at how drivers are paid, they don't look at the economics of the industry as driving the safety, they're missing the biggest factor. And I was on a panel, a National Academy of Sciences panel, that reported to them, did an analysis of their data and said, this is what you got to do to improve your data quality. And I think they're improving their data quality a lot. And again, they really are. It's quite astounding data, and it's all public. It's all available. It's not secret. So the European Union data, they won't give it to me because they think I might come up with something they didn't want to see. So, okay, fine. But in the US, they're really doing all that. But because of this blind spot that's on pay, they're not collecting that information. And we recommended that they collect information, at least the average pay per driver, full-time driver at the firm. And if we had that by company, we would be able to do more precisely what Shenyang Zhu and I did in that paper I just showed you that is going to go out to review shortly. That paper predicts really strongly that pay is the biggest factor. So I think that the way you solve the problem is you collect data on the pay and then you run those estimations and see just what that number is. I think you'll find that the biggest bang for the buck is going to come from the buck. Well, we use the term buck and it's an American term, but you know perfectly well what I mean. It's all about the money.
It is, exactly. I can't argue. Dr. Belzer, I'm sorry, but we have run out of time and I do have a full day today, but thank you so much and greetings from your friends here in Australia. I look forward to when our Earth returns to normality and we can catch up either.
I've got my vaccine. I bring you one too.
I'm not allowed to have one for a few months. There are people that need to get it before me, but don't worry, I will take it as soon as it comes. Dr. Belzer, thank you so much and hopefully we'll catch up in the near future. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.